So many of you may not know that I actually just came back from a trip with Reverend Jeanette where we went together to Puerto Rico. And it was my great honor to have some time there with the people who have been recovering on the anniversary, the exact 6-month anniversary since Hurricane Maria made its way to that island. And here's a question that kept on coming up for us in very practical terms. We asked, is it alive or is it dead? Is it alive or is it dead? This is a central and real question in many ways, as we actually wound our ways through cratered streets. And as we would drive on roads, this is again in technically the United States, 6 months after Hurricane Maria. And I would, much as you see maybe these banners hanging here, there would be something like a power pole that was just leaning so precariously on the streets. And so you always wonder, is that power pole carrying real power? Are the wires hanging from there alive or dead? At one point, for air, which we needed on these windy roads, Reverend Jeanette had her window down, and I said, you know what, we better put that up, because she was on the passenger seat side, which is closer to where the wires would be, because, you know, as they'd sort of flap in the wind in these United States, 6 months after Hurricane Maria, you never knew, although you could probably count on the wire not being live, because so much of the island has no electricity. Is it live, we would ask, because it would swing past us on the road. And as we tried to make it from one place to another, even in the places of more consistent repair, like in the capital city, San Juan, the power grid still swung free. You don't hear this here, where they say, what are the statistics they say? 70% of the island now has power. That's false. It's just not true. All you have to do is look outside at night and wonder where you see light, and you see it's just in these pockets of tourism, not everywhere else. It's a lie if you're hearing that it's something else. Anyway, so we round our way up through these roads in shameless disrepair in these United States, technically, to a place that some would be quick to declare dead, unreachable, too remote, too stubborn, doing its own thing instead of following orders, which, by the way, was why we wanted to visit, because anyone who knows me knows that orders are hard to follow. So we journeyed through the land of Reverend Luis Alfredo and Reverend Evelyn in Ponce, and then we drove up into the mountains where, God willing, hopefully Reverend Luis Alfredo will be able to settle there again soon. But anyway, so thanks to Reverend Jeanette's careful planning, we went up into the mountains and under the poles and through the live wires, hopefully not, and eventually we landed in one of the more remote towns called Ajuga, which we knew to be, at least initially, involuntarily off the grid, unreachable to most people. Now, these folks wanted to know all the details about who was coming as they prepared hospitality for us. And they wanted to know, like, what does the pastor like to eat, and what will she need, and what will her family need as they come? And they honored us with the opportunity to sit in on one of their community meetings, one of their many, as they made some choices about what they were going to do. And we were welcomed into this space, and as we listened, we learned some things about this set of questions. Is it alive or is it dead? Because by so many calculations, from the extreme loss of life that also goes underreported, to emigration away from the community, particularly from some able-bodied and young folks who really needed to find employment, to restoration of amenities, to access to things that I consider the very basics, like electricity and mobile phone coverage and protein-rich foods and running water. I was expecting at least signs of death everywhere. and maybe even resignation or a lack of hope or frustration or anger with death as master of the mount. And there was death, senseless, preventable, and probably prosecutable death on this island, which we call ourselves to be in a protectorate relationship with, but where so many balls have been dropped that you'd wonder precisely who is being served, who's being represented, and whose interests are being protected. Is it alive or is it dead? We kept asking after the umpteenth down severed electrical cord. I'd always been trained to, when you see this after a storm, I lived in Connecticut for many years, and we got storms all over the place with the wires, much like we have in here. By the way, we're under construction. You may be wondering, are we safe? Because there is something like a metaphor for this. Imagine if these were just swinging around. And when you see that, I don't know about you, but I've been trained that you stop, and you turn around, and you find another route. You don't try to make your way through, but imagine then your life is trying to navigate these. And what if turning to another route actually didn't preserve life, but led to more death? And I want to cut to the point here because it's Easter and many of you are not trained to sit through a long sermon. But my perspective, history, and experience had not trained me to have a sufficient answer to this question of whether something is alive or whether it's dead. And how do you usually gauge this? How do you check for life? You look for a pulse. You look for breath. But now imagine this. Imagine that there are countless, let's say 30, ways to find a pulse and you only know one. Imagine that there are hundreds of ways to perceive breath, and you've only been trained to notice one or two. How much might you miss? And I'm just going to say that was me. That's the way when you know only a limited definition of life. And what I discovered in Ajuga is that they knew so many more, and they taught me so many more. Because breath doesn't stop with empire's power. And I didn't even know that. One of the first corrections someone gave me is I kept saying, well, so much of this island is without power. No. We have infinite power. We just don't have electricity. And as one woman said, Irma and Maria, these are the two hurricanes, because remember, there were two right back to back in the Caribbean. Irma and Maria, she said, were actually our greatest teachers. And the lesson that they taught, she explained, was that the places that they had looked for life were not the source of life at all. And she said, now this is a woman, I'll get back to who she is, but she said this. She said, you may think I'm lonely and isolated, she said. You may think I'm lonely and that I've been feeling that as I live up on this mountain that people have such a hard time getting to, because she was way farther into the mountains than we were. She said, you may think I'm lonely, but I'm never alone because I have the power of God with me, which no one can take. And I thought, of course, she would be just distraught, and that she, living there with her ailing husband who just had surgery on one of the highest peaks of the island, whose house was hit by the storm harder than most, who has a blue FEMA tarp roof over her head, but most of the walls in her home are gone. As her son explained to me, if you go to the bathroom in her house, you will have some of the blue FEMA roof over your head, but there's no wall between you and the jungle just outside. And she's been living like this for 6 months, and they refused to leave. Her son kept saying, please, can we please leave? Can we bring you back to the mainland? But it turns out that her husband is a master skilled electrician, and he's the one who has the gifts to help bring electricity back to the people around him because they've been forgotten by everyone else. And she refuses to take his power out of the island. Now, they didn't have all these things that I would expect to be very basics, but she explained to us that they had infinite power they're not going to give up. We may appear to be lonely, but there's no possible way for me to be alone, Pastor, because I have God, and God will never forsake me. She explained, will never leave me alone. What I would argue here is that this is the essence of resurrection, and it can easily be lost if we take the essence of life for granted or look in the wrong places for life. And crisis subverts things in a way that brings us particularly close to God. So many people try to look to me to explain what resurrection is. Someone asked me just yesterday, what does that mean in real life? And how does the transition from life to death to resurrected life make sense? And people want an explanation, I think, for something that can't be explained. But it can be shown. God is in the midst of resurrecting so much, blurring the lines between what we expect to be dead and what God is making alive and new even right now. And God is consistently in the business of making things live that seemed hopeless and done and dead. God is always injecting breath into that which seems breathless. God, as someone said recently, is always visiting the dead places. God is always visiting the dead places and bringing life. Sometimes we don't know how to find God. Sometimes it's hard to read the pulse where even courses so strong because we don't know how sometimes we need to hear the space between breaths to see God's miracles. And sometimes, as in Puerto Rico, as in Ajuga, God is showing us how the old places and the old systems and the old dependencies we thought brought life actually put us in place for the opposite. Never forget that God visits the dead places to demonstrate life. Now, each of you has dead places. Each of us has a dead place within our minds and our hearts. We have places that perhaps even to the naked eye look perfect, but they actually suck life and energy and time away from us. They appear to be just right, these places, these dead places, but in truth, they're like a succubus that depletes us of all that we need to live while the world around us actually rejoices on it. For some, maybe it looks like a great job. For others, it's a beautiful home, or a great partner or spouse, or a great family. When you really peel away the onion, there's so much death there. And the crisis of the cross reminds us that we have these teachers in our lives who instruct us on God's definition of life versus death. God pours light into life. Meanwhile, we pour entirely too much energy into death. Now, when it seemed like she was stuck in the direst moment of death and grieving, Mary Magdalene decided to show up to the dead place. She went where literally no one else would go except for the prison guards paid to watch that body. And she showed up to the dead place. Beautifully, so did Jesus. And here's the good news about God. God realized that there were a people who needed a different approach to divine possibility, and God decided to show up, to be born a human, to walk earth, not as the ruler he was, but vulnerably. And as God walked in life and gave life, Jesus saw that we were preoccupied with and fixated on so many things of death. Things that ate away at us and dragged us into the dead spaces. And God saw this, but God was God and didn't fall for it in the same way that we do. But God decided to show up to the dead place anyway, and that's what we see on Good Friday. The creed says that he descended into hell. And the dead place turned out not to be a place of death for God. Because of this, the dead place, and this is the message of the resurrection, because of this, the dead place is not dead to us either. In a place that appeared to be powerless, in a place that seemed to be cut off from everything that I would care about, I learned from the teachers of crisis. I learned from the instructors of wisdom whose tenacity and faith made them persevere in the face of death, and I watched them witness to Christ's visit in a place of death as they showed the resurrection. Hope in the face of loss, strength even without a wall in their house. I learned how not to confuse electricity with power, because as I learned from them, God's power doesn't need a grid. God's power can't be cut off with the limitations of political patronage. God's power isn't aligned with any party or television network. God's strength is not gained by retweets or likes. God depends not on a single one of this earth's current measures of success. Instead, God looks to the dead places, to the sites that are invisible, to the people who are untouchable, to the places of shame in your heads and in your hearts where even you don't want to go. And God looks at that dead place and says, rise, live. You do not have to be subject to all this death. Because perceivable or not, life never ends. And notice or not, God's power won't be stopped. Grave or not, what God has blessed cannot be contained. Death may very well sting, as it has stung so many of us. But the grave certainly has no victory. Victory, power, and life are God's, no matter what this world might try to teach you. Look with courage to your dead places, those places you hope a soul will not look, those moments that haunt you in the hours between bed and rest, those things that hurt, that teach you that if you were to show up authentically and fully yourself, that you wouldn't be loved anymore. Those are your dead places. All of that is death. Thanks be to God, God already knows it. God's already been there, and God says, forever and ever, amen, let there be life. So don't miss breath. Don't miss the resurrecting power of God's Spirit. If you get nothing else from this sermon, please get this. God visited the dead place and said, never again. Never again will death have a lasting hold over your life. Never again will dying have the last word. Never again will your spirit's state lay in turmoil. Why? Because God is life, period, now and eternally. From the dead places, even yours, we can proclaim this good news truth that Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Can you say that? Christ is risen. Christ is risen. You are risen. I am risen. I will rise. I will rise. Get up if you want to rise, church. I will rise. I will rise. I am risen. The dead places are not my place of death anymore. The dead places are not my place of death anymore. God is breathing life into my life. Death will never win again. And let the church say, amen.